And the Human Zoos is also tells the story of, because I want to, a lot of what we're talking about has been negative, but I also like focusing on, and this is even in my book, about the positive things that Christians can do and what happens when they're faithful. And I talk about that in various sections of my book. So don't be disheartened by this. God is calling us to be faithful, and God honors that. And so like with Human Zoos, yes, there were these scientific racists and some Christians who unfortunately went against the Bible and went along with that, but there were also white and black Christians who stood up against what was doing. And the Human Zoos is actually, they would actually put African people on display as missing links in the Darwinian story, and they'd put them on display and put fences around them. In the most egregious case, they actually put a young African man in the primate house in a cage along with monkeys and put him on display in the Bronx Zoo. And this was celebrated by the New York Times. It was celebrated by leading Darwinian biologists. The only people who stood out against it was a white pastor in New York City and some black pastors, because they said, you don't do this with someone created in the image of God. That Human beings are not monkeys.
Welcome everybody to Hope for Our Times, and listen, today I have a very special guest. Joining me is Dr. John G. West. He's an award-winning author, filmmaker, cultural commentator, vice president also of Discovery Institute. He's written Darwin Day in America and produced documentaries including Firemaker. He holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University and has shared his insights on CNN, Fox News, and Reuters. And we are going to dive right into it. But welcome, Dr. West. Thank you for joining me.
Pastor Tom, thanks for having me.
I have so many questions for you, especially in light of what is being exposed regarding what's going on in colleges, the professors, what's being taught. I'm going to ask you how long these things have been going on. We obviously are coming. Charlie Kirk was murdered just a couple of weeks ago. But we've been alerting people as much as I can to what's going on with indoctrination and the manipulation and good kids being sent off to college, and all of a sudden, a year into college, their mind's been changed. And we see this happening everywhere. So I want to get into that. How long has it really been going on? Because I think it's been going on a long time. But I'm going to go here first, because you have written about the Stockholm Syndrome. Even I think, is it your book called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity?
Christianity, yep, it is.
So can you explain what is the Stockholm Syndrome first, and then the effect on the Christian church, and then we're going to get into colleges and what's really going on.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, Stockholm Syndrome goes back to this bank robbery in the 1970s in Stockholm, Sweden, hence the name, where some bank robbers held hostage, people who worked for the bank for several days. Now, that's happened before, but what was strange in this case, and which is why it's so memorable, is that a few days into it, the people being held hostage began to identify more with the hostage takers, which the people who were victimizing them, than they were with the police or other people. They actually started to feel grateful toward the people who took them hostage, and they thought they were nice young men, and they started to defend them. And so out of this came this idea that sometimes when people are victimized in an abusive situation, or when there's pressure around them, that they can end up identifying with the person who's abusing them or victimizing them. And so I think how this applies to Christians is, in America at least, many Christians, if we're growing up to wherever you are in this country, in the South, the North, the West, the East, you are surrounded by people who really hate Orthodox Christianity. They may not hate Christians, they may be personally nice to you, but their worldview is diametrically opposed to Orthodox Christianity, to biblical Christianity. And when you start to study under these people, say when you go to college, when you're in the workplace, and those are your peers, A Christian can take this a couple of different ways. They can stand strong and be salt and light, like Jesus calls us to be, or once you just get hammered by all these people, you begin to look to them as your peer group, and you actually are grateful to them, and you start to identify their assumptions as your own. And so I think this is a problem for many Christians today. We sort of wonder, why do so many Christians, especially leading Christians, some pastors, tragically, Christian college professors, Christians in the media, some Christians in politics, why do they look so much like the secularists around them? Why do their talking points seem so much like the secularists around them? And I think in my own personal experience with people, when I was at a Christian college for 12 years, the way I've seen this is that these people end up being influenced by those secularists and actually taking their cues from them and actually being grateful to them and adopting their worldview more than, so they identify more with the secularists around them than they do with their own historic biblical faith.
Wow. So when I look at these things, I remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but I'm old enough to remember Patty Hearst. And you remember the story behind?
I was a little kid, but I do remember. She was a classic Stockholm Syndrome. Yeah, I mean, you can tell the story, or I can.
You can tell this. I'll briefly introduce. I'll let you tell it. So Patty Hearst was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst. And William Randolph Hearst is the one who had this massive mansion, all this property up in the central coast of California, thousands upon thousands of acres. He was a well-known publisher. He was one of the richest men in the world at the time. You can visit Hearst Castle. I've written about Hearst Castle in one of my upcoming books, actually, and with William Randolph Hearst. But so she gets kidnapped. And then that went on by, I can't remember the name of the group. It was
Symbionese Liberation Army.
That's what it was. Okay. But then all of a sudden these pictures started coming out there where she seemed to be supportive of them. So what was going on with that?
Yeah, so she ended up doing bank robberies with them, and part of the argument was that she was an example of Stockholm Syndrome. I will say, Stockholm Syndrome is a bit of a controversial diagnosis in the area of psychology, and there's a real question about whether Patty Hearst really was a victim of that, because she was under a lot of pressure. I mean, these people were nasty people, and so it's not clear that she really did do this of her own volition, and so that she was really a Stockholm Syndrome. But I do think the general insight that I've known a lot of people that are not under duress, that end up adopting the views of the people they studied under in graduate school, or if they're in the media, the other people in the newsroom, because they want to be liked by them, and they end up subconsciously sometimes, but sometimes consciously, adopting their talking points. And so rather than being missionaries to the culture, they're basically missionaries to their fellow Christians from the secularists. And so I do think this is a real thing. Patty Hearst is probably the most famous example, but I know there's been a lot of debate over whether she actually really was a victim of Stockholm Syndrome.
So there was also work, I think it was a book called Manchurian Candidate. And with that it builds on a fictional story, but there's truth in it. And how these people taken captive, I think it was in China, is that right?
Yeah, North Korea, but by China, because of course China was behind a lot of the Korean War. So yeah, it was the Korean conflict, but it was captive by Chinese propagandists and sort of brainwashed.
Brainwashed. So in that case, it's taking a prisoner and dealing with them by just repeating things over and over and over again. There can be physical torture involved. I believe what can happen is, in the case of that, it is getting people to deny that they ever did certain things they did, but then think they did certain things they never did do. And you can completely change a person's mind if you, depending on who the person is, and with enough pressure applied and also enough kindness applied at the same time, you can completely get people to think they did something they never did.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that we can be persuaded or coerced into doing, and that can be very tragic. Again, I think in this case, all I'm really talking about is because people may think, well, I'm not being tortured or I'm not being brainwashed by Chinese communists. Well, that may well be the case, but think about your own influences and the people that you know, and are they sounding more like historic Christians, or are they more sounding like the culture? And if they're more sounding like the culture, and you begin to ask them, in my own personal experience, I think of people who I've known that this is the case, that they actually take their cues from the surrounding culture, and they don't think. Here's the key thing, actually, that I didn't emphasize before. People who are Stockholm Syndrome Christians, they think they're standing up for truth. They don't think they're being a sellout. They're so convinced by, say, secular talking points that the problem is just with Christians, because the Christians are so intolerant, the Christians are so unloving. They actually adopt that, and they think that's true. And so they think when they are attacking their, say, fellow Christians or historic Christian beliefs, they're persuaded that they are saying something true and speaking truth to power. So they're not just these people don't understand themselves as sellouts, because I think sometimes people say, oh, these people are just cowardly, they're just currying favor. Well, there's some of that, we're all subject to that. But the really unique thing here with the Stockholm Syndrome Christian is they think what they're doing is right, even though it's not. They have adopted those points of views and actually think they're speaking truth, even though in fact they're basically aping the talking points of the secular non-Christians.
So, for example, we hear now where people will say, you label something like a Christian, you can label them, well, they're just Nazis, so we need to get rid of that person. And they think they're actually doing good for the country or for their people. And that's what's happening here, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And if you look, again, I mean, we can go through some of them, but in the examples of my book, I'm talking primarily about Christian leaders, self-identified evangelical Christian leaders. So let's look at the most powerful scientist in America for more than a decade. His name is Francis Collins. I think Francis Collins is a sincere Christian, isn't that he, from his own testimony from being atheist and becoming a Christian, that he thinks Jesus is his Lord and Savior. But if you look at how he spent his career, and he was upheld by many Christians as this great example because he was on the cover of Time magazine. But if you actually look at his actions and his comments of what he actually did and preached with that power, I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to distinguish him from the most ardent atheist secularist. I mean, when he was the head of the National Institutes of Health, the most powerful scientist in America, spending billions of our tax dollars, what did he do? Well, among other things, he spent millions of dollars to set up a tissue bank at a university to harvest baby parts from babies up to 40 weeks in gestation to do medical experiments on them. Okay, I don't think that's compatible with the Christian faith, but he thought he was doing good. He was persuaded that harvesting baby parts from babies up to 40 weeks in the womb is good. So then, one other thing that he did, he spent even millions of dollars more at the NIH to help fund the promotion of these, giving puberty blockers to kids, to doing so-called gender, surgery on kids. It's actually, it's biologically destructive, where you're cutting off breasts or other body parts from young men or women to create as if they could change their biological sex, which is not true. But he spent millions of tax dollars promoting that.
So to put it into context for everybody that's watching this, to understand who Francis Collins is, he is the one, when it came to DNA, wasn't he like the discoverer of what was it?
Yeah, so he was part of, he helped lead something called the Human Genome Project, which helps sequence our DNA, and so and that's an admirable thing that gave him a lot of That's why he was on the cover of Time magazine. And then he became known as a Christian, a person of faith who believed in God, who was a person of science. But then if you actually, again, looked at what he did, and in fact, here's sort of a very sad praise of him. After his career, there were some articles in left-wing journals like Slate and I forget the other ones, where they said, we were concerned when Francis Collins was appointed because he was this evangelical Christian. But basically their argument was, we shouldn't have been concerned because he basically did everything we wanted, whether it be on abortion or on, gay transgender issues. And so if anything, he helped deflect criticism from us from the Christian community. And so he was great. I'd have to say, if I were Francis Collins and I read that type of praise of my career, I'd be heartbroken.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm talking about when it's Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. I don't, some people question Francis Collins' private faith. I don't do that because I can't judge the state of his heart. And so I'm willing to assume that he is what he says he is. But there is a disjunction between that private faith and what he actually thinks is good. And when you actually look at his career, because sometimes one reason why this is so important to emphasize is I sometimes hear Christians who are really sincere say, well, all we need to do is recruit more Christians into politics or public life, and then everything's going to be fine. Well, you can recruit more Christians into public life until the cows come home. If there's Stockholm Syndrome Christians like Francis Collins, you're going to get the exact same garbage. It's not going to change. And so it's not enough to just bring in personally sincere Christians. They actually have to have a genuinely Christian worldview. They actually have to be consistent. Their public positions actually have to fit with the historic Christian faith. And too often, evangelical Christians, and I count myself as an evangelical Christian, have been so smitten by celebrity culture that anyone who's in power who says, I'm born again, suddenly we say, we uphold them as that we should follow them. Well, that's not enough. Probably the most absolutely insane example of this, and now I'm dating myself because this is a little bit after the time of Patty Hearst. It was a few years after that, in the early 80s, when the publisher of Penthouse magazine, Larry Flynt, one of the worst, most vile pornographers in the world, suddenly said, he's found Jesus. Well, I wish that were true, but it became clear that, he didn't change anything about his life. And then he didn't really find Jesus. So, but you had so many Christians who were celebrating that when they announced it without actually, trying to, look more with more wisdom as to whether that was actually true. And so I think Christians really have to be skeptical of the celebrity culture that holds up anyone in public life who claims to be a Christian. And even if they are personally a sincere Christian, that doesn't mean that they're going to be consistent in their public life, in what they promote. And in fact, some of the most, in my view, and this is part of the point of my book, Christians often, they say, the culture is going to the sewer because of the atheists, the agnostics, the secular left. And I don't discount that's true. But if you really look at it, a lot of leading self-identified Christians in politics, in academia, in entertainment, even in the church, have been pushing the exact same stuff, maybe slightly watered down. And I think that the church collectively needs to look to themselves before we can expect atheists and agnostics to uphold the truth. If we're not willing to uphold the truth, say about marriage, about biblical marriage, and I'm not just talking about things like same-sex marriage, I'm talking about things like no-fault divorce. There are some difference of opinion among biblical Christians about what the limited biblical grounds for divorce may be, but at a minimum, we ought to be able to agree that God hates divorce and that we should do everything possible to try to avoid divorce, and that we should. But how many Christians starting in the 1960s with the rise of no-fault divorce gave up on that? Well, how can we expect the secular culture to do better when we aren't being biblically faithful ourselves. And so that's probably, the really the underlying message of my book is that we have to, as Christians, need to get our own house in order, if we're going to be salt and light, which Christ calls us to be, we have to make sure we really are salt and light before we obsess about what other people are doing. I mean, we should be concerned about what the seculars are doing too, but we really need to look at what ourselves and what our own leaders are doing.
Yep, I agree. I've been a pastor for many years now, and I feel like I can say it because I am a pastor, and I was a senior pastor for 20 years, and I was an associate pastor for a number of years also. And I look, and there are not very many pastors that are willing to stand firm on this book. I mean, they won't even teach the Old Testament. It's too offensive. They won't teach much of the New Testament because it's offensive. They avoid everything. But the Apostle Paul warns in the last days, the people will raise up for themselves teachers to itch their ears that will bring just fables and stories, and they will not put up with the truth, won't endure sound doctrine. And you start looking at seminaries. I mean, I can look at seminaries and go, oh my, these things they are in seminaries. So when you're teaching these guys who are going to become pastors, and you have a woke culture that's in many seminaries, and they're not all bad, but a lot of them are. A lot of the Christian colleges, you write about that, and you have this, I mean, judgment begins at the house of God. And I believe that if churches were doing what they were supposed to be doing, what they've been commissioned to do, we wouldn't be in the situation in America that we are. It's interesting, Dr. West, there's a whole lot of people in Christianity, and I will say that call themselves Christians. I'll call them churchgoers, and I'll call them so-called pastors, right? And they become totally anti-Israel because they say Israel never fulfilled their calling, and then it's because of them they rejected the Messiah. But then, so therefore, we're anti-Israel today, 2,000 years later. Well, they're doing the same thing. They're not faithful to their calling. They're not proclaiming the truth of God. Instead, they brought in all of the pagan cultures, just like ancient Israel did. They brought in the pagan cultures into the church. They bring them into the pulpit. They give them different names. Instead of talking about your best life in heaven, they talk about your best life now. Let's see how we can get this. And then you bring in all these dynamics to feed yourself. And you look at these things and you're going, no. It's supposed to be about the Lord himself and the kingdom that is coming and where we are going. Instead, we've made it about everything that we can get. The church has become narcissistic.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the issue of Israel and Jews, because when I was growing up, it was beyond belief to me that there would be Christians who are anti-Jewish, because, I mean, yes, everyone needs a savior, and that includes Jews who haven't accepted Christ. But I grew up with books like The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, and just and yet one of my graduate professors, who is since deceased, he unfortunately was not saved. He was a secular agnostic Jewish person, Pulitzer Prize winner in history. But one of the things that really alienated him from Christianity, he told a story that I found hard to believe. It was true, I think, but now what's happening really gives me a new perspective. When he was a young man, he was kept off the local baseball team by local bullies who ended up calling him a Christ killer because he was a Jew. And that was just, and I told him, I said, that's not where Christianity is at now. But, that was his growing up. Now, this would have probably been in like the 1930s America. And the frightening thing is now, what we're seeing even in some segments of Christianity, of people who hate Jews. And look, I understand, I actually am supportive of Israel, but I understand there are different theological beliefs about eschatology and all this. Okay, let's put that aside. The Apostle Paul, Jesus is clear that we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves, and the Apostle Paul talks about his great love for his people, in Romans. So whatever you think about end times, and, that is no excuse to not to love Jews or to have an appreciation for Jews as and also to believe that God still has a plan for them. Again, there are different views on eschatology. Paul is clear on that. And it is so heartbreaking right now to see some people who claim the name of Christ, and I think some are sincere, but I think some are from the pit of hell, and they're not really Christians, who are demonizing Jewish people, who are, papering over the people who would try to exterminate Israel. I mean, it is appalling. I mean, I never really thought that we would be living through a period that is so reminiscent of the early 1930s. And it's just, and that there would be people who claim the name of Christ who are actually pushing some of this satanic, toxic stuff. And so, yeah.
It's terrible. I had a guest on recently. He's Jewish. He's not a believer in Jesus, not yet. But he was telling me some of the statistics. He gave me the statistics of how many Muslims there are in America. And then he said neo-Nazis. And I didn't believe his number. This goes back probably about 8 months. I was thinking, that seems like a stretch. And I think it was pretty high for me. It was something like 10 million in America. And I thought to myself, there's no way there's 10 million neo-Nazis. It was mainly targeting a hatred of Jews. But now I'm watching everything. I'm going, it is prevalent. I'm thinking his number may have been low, because it's like everywhere I look, and it has totally infected the church, and it's very disturbing. And something I have to reiterate all the time is, you're not saying, and I'm not saying, that everything Israel does is righteous. Never said that. I don't know of any government in the history of the world that's done everything righteous. That's why we need Jesus to come back, because we are saying that we're understanding God's covenant with the people of Israel, and it is different, and it's a spiritual dynamic.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And again, if you have the heart of Christ, the sorts of rhetoric that is coming out from some, fortunately, I think it still is on the fringe, but 30 years ago, I wouldn't have even found it on most of the fringe, but people who are vocalizing that they're Christians and they hate Jews, and Jews are responsible for this or that. It's just like, this is really from the pit of hell. And I think that Christians, especially when it comes to this, need to, and I'm not talking about legitimate differences of opinion about foreign policy. I'm not talking about even end times eschatology, but the Bible is clear, and Paul is clear. We should have a heart for Jews, and that includes Jews who are not Christians yet. That is, and so this is just so tragic. And I do admit, I'm a bit astounded. I do know, there has been this pocket of these anti-Jewish people, even among some Christians, but it was really a tiny fringe. And in the last 2 or 3 years, I can't say blossom because that sounds good. It's actually like a cancerous, malignant growth. It has grown some, and I think it really needs to be put down. But I do remember, this has existed throughout history. I remember when I was in graduate school, I stayed with a couple. They were devout Catholics, and I found some material that the husband was having that was like from the white Aryan nations that attacked not just blacks, but Jews, and I just was horrified. I ended up moving out of that home. Wow. But it was, and you wouldn't have known them from these were upstanding people. I just thought that gave me a little hint that no, there is this thing, but that was, really sort of below the surface. But now it's festered. And again, it's one thing for secularists to do that, which is awful, but for Christians, people who claim the name of Christ, to hate Jews and spew vile venom against Jews is horrific. I mean, it really is satanic.
Yeah, it is. In fact, everyone, it's the reason why I do have my latest book out, Israel's Place in God's Eternal Plan, to help educate Christians, people who claim to be Christians or just want to know, what does the Bible actually say about Israel? It has 15 different chapters loaded with scripture, explanation, and all in context. And I deal with it, with the disobedience of the nation of Israel. In there, I deal with God's future plan for Israel, what happened in the past, what's going on in the present. But you can check it out at the website, hopeforourtimes.com, and see how to get your copy. Okay, with that, John, I look at, you have documentaries you've done Your book, I want to get to your documentaries in a second, but let me ask you this, and then we're going to, because I find all of this so necessary to be educated, understand what's going on. So I have it's an interview I've shown at many conferences I've spoken at. In fact, I just used it at Texas this past weekend. And it is Yuri Bezmenov. He was a Soviet defector. The interview, you may have seen it, it's from 1982. And he goes through the 4 stages of what the Soviets would do to take over a people, what the communists, what the Marxists would do. It was demoralize, desensitize, destabilize, create a crisis, and then normalize. Their normalize is take control of everything. But the first thing he says, demoralize. And when watching it from 1982, he's talking about the United States in 1960s and 70s, how we've already been there. And he says, once you demoralize the people, facts don't matter. You can say if something is black, but if somebody wants to disagree and you say it's white, it's white. Facts do not matter. And so he's referring to the 60s and 70s, but you look at where we are, how long, and he's talking about colleges mostly in that interview, but how long has this been going on here in America? I mean, we watch what's going on in Europe. It's shocking. Europe is like in this horrible collapse, but this has been going on for a long time. And is there any way, apart from a miracle from God, to get a hold of people's minds? I mean, how long has it been going on? Is there any way to change it?
So, in one sense, there's no way to change it because we're sinful, but there is a way to not let the evil prevail, even though it will still exist. So, in one sense, I would actually say it has gone on since the very beginning of the country. Even the 1790s and 1800s, we had some Americans who were in the thrall of the French Revolution, which was very anti-Christian, and they thought that was great. It wasn't the majority. And that's the key. And you had the Second Great Awakening. You had loads of Christians who were involved in culture, and so it didn't take over. But by mid-19th century, you did have something. You talk about colleges. Many people don't know that the original colleges in the United States, like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, were all established as devoutly evangelical Christian institutions to spread the gospel. By the mid-19th century, most all of those had, they still believed in God, but it was sort of a Unitarian God. They didn't believe in Jesus as God. They didn't believe that the Bible was God's word in a supernatural sense. And so those original Christian colleges like Harvard, Princeton, Yale basically had gone over into a warmed over Enlightenment secularism with, a patina of, they weren't actually atheists yet, but they basically, didn't accept biblical Christianity. Now, out of that could have been a disaster, but I give credit to the Christians of the time because they established a whole new group of Christian colleges and seminaries to actually teach the faith to the next generation, so there would be a clear remnant and more than a remnant. And those Christian colleges did a lot of good work. But then you reach the 20th century. And even the 1920s and 30s, you then see battles on that. And then post-World War II, and especially when you get to the 60s and 70s, then you have this, it's no longer just sort of this deism that Jesus isn't God and the Bible is nice morally, but it's filled with myths. Now they're actually rejecting biblical morality too, and rejecting that any God exists. Sort of, this is post-Darwin, that science now shows that we're just blind matter in motion and that everything is relative, and that if there's going to be any reality, it needs to be a Nietzschean reality where we create our own reality and impose it. And that's sort of the stories from the 60s onward. And so the rot. Well, here's another thing. I was actually just talking with someone who was a Christian leader, and he was astounded when I told him this. There was a survey in the early 1900s by, I think he was either an atheist or an agnostic, James Loiba, of college professors in the early 1900s. And by the early 1900s, college professors in the sciences, in the social sciences, were already now overwhelmingly atheists and agnostics at America's leading institutions. And he was astounded because he thought, well, maybe it went back to the 60s or 70s. So it goes back a long ways. But the good news was that Christians were sufficiently active that they did raise up alternatives, and those alternatives really did raise up a lot of faithful people. And so, even in the 70s, you have people like Francis Schaeffer. You have many people who were outstanding Christian leaders who were speaking the truth to the culture and raising up new generations of faithful Christians. But now I think that a lot of those people, because in the 1970s, things were really bad. We were on the cusp of supporting gay marriage then, and there were a lot of things that were actually happening in the administration, say, of Jimmy Carter, who was a devout personal Christian, but was another Stockholm Syndrome Christian when it came to public policy. It was not great. But there were a faithful remnant who ended up training up a new generation of active Christians that helped turn the tide back to some semblance of sanity. And we were running off that in the 1980s into the early 90s. And now, sadly, I think that has run out. And so the call is for the current generation of Christians to step up. Because, and Christian colleges, this is, so we rely on, where are the Christian leaders? The leading Christians are going to be Christians who are going to be leading in politics, in the arts, in the pastorate. Who do we rely on to fashion those people? It's the seminaries and the Christian colleges. But so many of them now have become co-opted. And I write about this in my book. I write about in my book my own experience at a Christian university for 12 years, where I saw it basically, thanks to the decisions of the Board of Trustees, to go in a completely different direction. It still today says it's a Christian institution, but just a few years ago, over 70% of the faculty at that institution voted basically no confidence because they wanted the university to repeal its official statement that marriage was between one man and one woman. When you have more than 70% of the faculty, and actually the staff had a similar survey, who are voting against biblical marriage, you really don't have a Christian institution anymore, at least a faithful one, no matter what you say in your marketing. And there are too many Christian institutions like that. And so I think right now, we saw this, as in the controversies over the past couple of weeks when the vile assassination of Charlie Kirk. And, Charlie Kirk wasn't perfect, neither am I, but he was a devout Christian. He tried to honor Jesus. He tried to spread the gospel, and he tried to be faithful on biblical teachings on social issues. And he was assassinated because of that. Well, it's on a college campus. I've been tracking some of the leading evangelical Christian colleges. And did they say anything on this? Wheaton College and Calvin University are two of the most known in secular realms as being the top evangelical Christian institutions. At the time as we're talking here, they have not issued any public statements. I just checked before talking on that national tragedy of the assassination of a fellow evangelical Christian on a college campus. And so I think this is a great, and I've tracked some other Christian institutions too. This is an indicator of what's going on there. If they can't even bring themselves to publicly mourn, to publicly say this is wrong, because I don't know what, because they're cowardly, because they actually probably, they don't actually support what Charlie Kirk said, and so they don't want to even defend the fact that he was, that he shouldn't have been assassinated. Houston, we have a problem. I would encourage you, if you are a Christian who are spending a lot of money to send your young daughter and son to a Christian college and spending lots of money going to debt, you need to make sure, there are some good Christian colleges and universities and seminaries, but you need to make sure that that's where you're sending them. Because if you're not, it's actually more devastating, in my view, to go to a bad Christian college where I was at, we had people who, once they took the Bible courses, they had professors who were Christians who were telling them, you believe that? They were basically telling them that the Bible's filled with errors, but in the name of Christ. Well, I actually think that it's you're going to be more devastating to a sincere Christian young person who goes and hears a fellow Christian saying, "Oh, they're not an atheist claiming that; it's a Christian saying, oh, you believe naively that what the Bible says is true." At least if they confront an atheist at a secular university, they know that that person is coming out of a hostile worldview. But when they're at the Christian college, so I think don't just accept the marketing materials. Actually, if people go to my website for this book, StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com, they can get a free essay where I just go over 10 questions they can ask when considering a Christian college. And so that, Christian colleges changes, so I'm not going to give specific recommendations because ones that are good today might not be good 2 years from now. But there are some questions you can ask, like, get a list of if they have chapel, who is speaking at chapel? Are they people who are upholding biblical views of sexuality, or are they basically pushing woke Christianity? I mean, there are some basic questions that you can ask that when you get the answers to, you'll get a pretty good idea. I mean, does their campus health center refer students to Planned Parenthood? I mean, again, there's some basic questions you can ask that will give you an idea of whether that's really a faithful Christian institution or not. And the worst thing you can do is bankroll through tuition, or say you graduated from a Christian university that was good 30 years ago, but now it's fallen away. If you write that check to help support that university that has now gone off the rails, in many sense, you're worse than the woke Christians, because the woke Christians think, in many senses, that they're doing right, even though they're not. But you know that what they're doing is not right, and you're still writing a check for it.
I totally agree. People need to watch where they are sending their money. I think of how many, being in ministry for decades now, I look and go, man, there's some ministries out there that I know what they're really not doing, and it's like it's appalling, and they're actually anti-Christ rather than being pro the gospel, or and they can sound so nice. With colleges, couldn't be said more clearly. I've warned people for years, you better be careful on that Christian college, because that's in a regular secular college, you already know what you're confronting. You know who your enemy is. So you're prepared for that. Christian college, your guard is down and you're easily manipulated. One more thing, and I got to get to, it's a really good question before we wrap up that I think everybody's really curious about. But you mentioned with Wheaton College not even being willing to put out an official statement. Well, it's no wonder then why you have this Karen Bass, who's the mayor of Los Angeles, who sends out a notice, we are not flying our flags at half-mast. We're not going to do that here in the city of Los Angeles. Well, she's woke. She's a Marxist. She's the one that made sure there's no water in the fire hydrants when Pacific Palisades burned. She's the one that made sure you had only woke people serving in fire department and police department and everything else. Well, of course she's going to say that. But when you have a Christian, within Christianity, you can't even support the truth and facts. Well, what do you expect the pagans to do? They're just doing what they do. But when so-called Christian organizations can't press forward, it shows us the state that our culture is really in. John, real quick, then I want to get to our final question. Again, I wish we had more time, because I wanted to ask you about your documentaries and how to get your book. But real quick on your documentaries, what are they, and your books, and they can get them from you?
Yeah, so documentaries, I've done a lot that focus on how scientific materialism and Darwinism have impacted culture and on the devaluation of human life. So I did something called Human Zoos that talks about the impact of Darwinism on scientific racism. I've done a number on the positive evidence for intelligent design in nature. You mentioned earlier one on Firemaker that is just this fascinating story from biologist Michael Denton. We don't even think about it, the use of fire. That if we didn't have if humans couldn't use fire, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because you wouldn't have computers. Basically, everything that exists now in modern technology is based on our harnessing of fire, and everyone accepts this, even atheists. But what they don't realize is that if we didn't have a planet of the right size, if we didn't have nerve connections that were fast enough for us to actually manipulate certain things so that humans could create fire, and there's just on and on, these preconditions that have to be built in by God into nature, we would never have been able to use or harness fire. And so it's not just that, yeah, fire is this important thing, it's step beyond it and see all the intricate things that God had to provide for in nature in order for us to be able to utilize it. This is not just something that comes about by random processes or necessity. So that's one of the things. And with regard to my book, you could go to Amazon, you could go to the book's website, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity.com. Anywhere where you buy books, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, you can find it.
So that particular documentary you're talking about is called Fire Maker, is that right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay, you have the other one, Human Zoos.
Yep.
So that's intriguing.
And the Human Zoos also tells the story of, because I want to, a lot of what we're talking about has been negative, but I also like focusing on, and this is even in my book, about the positive things that Christians can do and what happens when they're faithful. And I talk about that in various sections of my book. So don't be disheartened by this. God is calling us to be faithful, and God honors that. And so like with Human Zoos, yes, there were these scientific racists and some Christians who unfortunately went against the Bible and went along with that, but there were also white and black Christians who stood up against what was doing. And the Human Zoos is actually, they would actually put African people on display as missing links in the Darwinian story, and they'd put them on display and put fences around them. In the most egregious case, they actually put a young African man in the primate house in a cage along with monkeys and put him on display in the Bronx Zoo. And this was celebrated by the New York Times. It was celebrated by leading Darwinian biologists. The only people who stood out against it was a white pastor in New York City and some black pastors, because they said, you don't do this with someone created in the image of God. That human beings are not monkeys. And so I also tell the positive story of the people who stood out against that.
Wow. I would encourage you, everyone, all of the things that Dr. West has are available through his website, not through Hope for Our Times, but through his website, as he said, also on Amazon and other places where you can find books. But Human Zoos, Fire Maker, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, check them all out. And we need to be well educated, and we need to be critically thinking, because, last question for you, and this applies to this, how long do you think professors in America have been corrupted with this Marxist ideology?
Well, I actually think that it goes back to the progressive era, the end of the 19th century, because you had the attack on the Constitution on neo-Marxian grounds based in the early 1900s by a guy named Charles Beard. Now, when it really basically completely took over, probably you're talking about the 60s and 70s, but it was a strong presence in the 1900s. And each generation gets worse. So in other words, if you don't stop it, generations could get better, but if you don't stop what's happening, then the next generation gets worse. And I even saw this in real time at the Christian university that I was at, because you had old line faculty who were not quite orthodox, but not quite unorthodox. But then they'd hire, the new generation that they would hire would be further unorthodox than them. In fact, it was kind of sad in a way, but telling that by the time I left, the younger generation of faculty that they were hiring were now basically making it uncomfortable for the older liberal generation of partly unorthodox people, because they weren't unorthodox enough. And so, the people facilitated their own destruction, because you had people who were a little bit heterodox, then hiring people who were even more because, they thought that's the future, this is great, and we want to be open-minded. And then the people they hired basically ended up eating them up. And so that, I do think it's been going a long time, but I think it also can change. And I have, since my book came out, and I don't want to give specifics, I don't want to be tied down to specific colleges and things, but I have learned of some colleges where real renewal has gone on, and where new administrators and presidents and things have been hired, and they've cleaned house. And so I would say, if you have a favorite university and maybe you're a significant donor or you know people on those boards, don't accept their excuses. Because there are cases, and I talk about one historic case in my book, but there are also cases right now where revival is happening and reform is happening. And this includes in churches, includes in seminaries, it includes in Christian colleges. And so if you have a favorite Christian institution where they're just asking for your check and they're giving excuses, well, we can't really change because of X, Y, or Z, don't allow them to call that bluff, because that's not true.
Oh, amen. Thank you so much. That's a great, encouraging place to leave to end our time together. It was fantastic with you, Dr. West. Thank you so much. I can't wait to have you back. I want to, next time on, I'm going to ask you some more about the documentaries, and we're going to go down that path, and also just more of the work that you have out there. You are such a blessing to the Christian community and people who aren't even believers to be able to wake up and see the truth. So thank you so much for joining us today. And God bless you, everybody. And make sure that you check out everything that Dr. West has. You can see his links right here in the description. And we'll see you next time.